Greetings, fellow wanderer. Every philosophy, every religion, and every human being walking this earth must eventually reckon with the stark reality of evil and suffering. Pain is the universal human currency, but within Christianity, this problem is stated with a particular, inescapable sharpness. It isn't because Christianity invented suffering, but because of what Christianity asserts about God. It affirms three immense claims simultaneously. 1. That God is all-powerful, or omnipotent. 2. That God is all-good, or omnibenevolent. And 3. That God is all-knowing, or omniscient. And here lies the classic collision. If God knows all suffering, has the power to stop it, and possesses a nature of absolute goodness, why does evil exist? Philosophers often split into two distinct pressures. First, there is the logical problem of evil. The formal debate over whether an all-good, all-powerful God and the existence of evil can logically coexist without contradiction. And second, there is the evidential problem, the far heavier weight of the sheer amount, severity, and seemingly senseless nature of the suffering we witness every day. Historically, believers have offered several paths through this landscape. The most common response to the logical problem is the free will defense. The argument suggests that for genuine moral goodness to exist, creatures must possess real freedom, the capacity to choose the right or to choose the wrong. A world with freely loving, morally significant beings may hold far greater ultimate value than a pre-programmed world of forced obedience, even if that freedom opens the door to terrible human cruelty. Alongside this is the idea of soul-making. This view suggests that we are not created as finished products, but as progressive beings. Suffering, hard as it is to endure, acts as a forge. It educates us by direct experiential contrast, showing us the ruin of evil versus the beauty of good. And it disciplines us, cultivating virtues like patience, courage, compassion, and maturity that could never grow in a friction-free paradise. But as many critics rightly point out, and as I've often felt myself, these answers begin to flounder when we step away from human choice and look at natural evil. What possible moral education does a young child receive from contracting an excruciating terminal disease? They didn't choose it through free will. They are not morally responsible for it. When we face that kind of raw tragedy, standard answers can feel sterile. Some point to the nature of natural law. For a world to sustain life, it must operate on consistent, predictable physical laws. The same gravity that keeps us grounded can cause a fall. The same natural forces that give us water and soil can produce earthquakes or cellular mutations. Some level of natural friction seems to be the necessary cost of a stable physical reality. Others remind us of skeptical theism, the simple, humbling realization that our finite human intellect is vastly limited. Just because we cannot discern a sufficient reason for a particular tragedy does not mean no reason exists within the infinite scope of divine wisdom. And classical theology reminds us that omnipotence does not mean doing logical impossibilities. God's power is not diminished because he cannot create a square circle, or construct a world filled with genuinely free creatures who are simultaneously incapable of falling. Omnipotence operates within logical coherence. Furthermore, Christian theology doesn't merely leave God as a distant architect watching the machinery. At its core, it makes the radical claim that God actually entered human suffering in Christ, taking on the weight of finitude, pain, and death, promising an eschatological restoration where all things are finally made right. For most of history, thinkers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas viewed evil not as a physical substance or an opposing cosmic force, but as privation, a lack, an absence, or a distortion of the good, much like darkness is simply the absence of light. I find myself drawn to this understanding, and as I've turned this over in my mind, my perspective has continued to evolve. I don't pretend to have a final, wrapped-up answer, if one even exists, but I want to share a framework that has brought me a measure of peace. Consider how we judge good and bad. When a car functions as its designer intended, we call it good. When a component breaks or malfunctions, we call it bad. Every created thing points ontologically upward to an outside standard to define its purpose and goodness. Evil or bad in any individual thing can very easily be explained and understood as privation. It doesn't matter how high up the ontological ladder you go either. So long as you are a being on the ladder, you have to keep looking up. Consider what Odin says here in God of War Ragnarok.
Know what drives me? What I really want? I want answers. Same as you. See, mortals have it easy. When they push up against life's big questions, they can look to us. They give them meaning, divine comfort. We both know that's a sham. But when we have questions, why are we here? To give meaning to mortals while living without it ourselves? No. We're more than that. And I found something that proves it.
As a god who sits at the top of the ontological ladder, he sees the limits of looking up. God cannot point upward. If God had to look up to a higher standard of goodness, he would not be God. Therefore, goodness is not an arbitrary rule God follows. Goodness is the very nature of God, of being himself. God is not a rung on the ladder, he is the ladder. If that is true, then any created creature simply by being finite is inherently lacking in the infinite fullness that God alone possesses. We possess elements of the good because we are made by him, but because we are bounded and finite, we carry an inherent vulnerability to non-being, the constant reality of our own limits. Perhaps then, our deepest struggle with the problem of evil isn't merely an intellectual puzzle to be solved through moral judgment. Perhaps the problem of evil is ultimately a problem of acceptance. How do I accept my own finitude, the finitude of others, and the fragile, limited nature of this world in light of God's infinite goodness? It is in the very nature of true goodness to accept and sustain that which is imperfect and unlike itself. God accepts us in our finitude. Perhaps instead of exhausting ourselves in endless analytical combat, trying to sit in judgment over existence itself, we ought to get about the quiet daily business of accepting him back. In pursuit of an acceptance like that, I suggest the simple adage that it be done one day at a time. That is all I have in my notes for today. I'd love to hear how these thoughts sit with your own reading and journey. Until next time, mind yourself and keep on wandering.